Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Final Fantasy IV. My name is Corbett Capon, and I'll be your host for the evening. Here with me is fellow Oscarina voter Randi. Randi, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here tonight, Corey. I'm glad to help out.
So, Final Fantasy IV is a Japanese role-playing game, otherwise known as JRPG, developed and published by Square, and released in 1991 for the Super NES. It is the fourth mainline entry in the Final Fantasy series, which is one of the most popular series of JRPGs. However, it tells a self-contained storyline independent of the first three games. The game follows Cecil, a dark knight in service to a king that has recently begun committing evil deeds. As Cecil tries to find answers for his king's recent changes in behavior, Cecil will uncover villains, join forces with a variety of interesting characters, and change his role from one complicit in corrupt deeds to a hero who strives to save the world. For noteworthy auteurs involved with the project, the game was directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi and was scored by Nobuo Uematsu, both of whom have significant involvement with the majority of other Final Fantasy titles. Final Fantasy IV is nominated for 5 official Oscarina categories, which are the following: Best Gameplay, Challenge and Achievement, Best Musical Theme for the song Prelude, Best Male Character for the main character Cecil, Best Direction, and Best Pixel 1991. So, to start things off, I think I will give a little introductory blurb about Best Gameplay, Challenge and Achievement, but Randi can jump in wherever she likes to add her own 2 cents. So,
I will say, if I can start with one little fun fact, Corey.
Sure.
JRPG is actually not a term that Japanese game developers use. They just consider them RPGs and actually think it's weird that we call them JRPGs.
Interesting, but do they have like a WRPG term for all of the not-Japanese RPGs, or no?
That I don't know.
Alright.
Yeah, some of them even consider JRPG like a derogatory term, and they had to be explained to that it's not necessarily seen like that.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah. Neat. Alrighty, so first and foremost, the reason why Final Fantasy IV is most being nominated for Best Gameplay Challenge and Achievement is that it invented what is termed the active time battle system. The most common style of battle is the strictly turn-based battle system, where your players would perform various actions, and then the enemy would perform various actions, and you would switch back and forth until one person emerged is victorious.
Yep, classic taking turns.
Yep. But what Final Fantasy IV did is it assigned every individual character a speed stat, which would determine how fast a bar would fill up, and once the bar was full, then you would have a chance to act. And in addition, while you were acting, the timer would continue ticking such that if you were not particularly fast, the enemy would get additional turns to attack you. So while you're making up your mind about how you're going to make your move, you're under time pressure because the faster you make your move, the more moves you'll get to make relative to the enemy. This battle system ended up being hugely influential. It was used for Final Fantasy V through Final Fantasy IX, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy X2, and according to Giant Bomb, 33 other games as well. What makes it interesting for me as a battle system is it adds mental energy as a new resource that you have to balance, similar to HP or MP, sort of like how real-time strategy games work. So you could potentially navigate through the menu in order to figure out, okay, here is the spell that would be best optimized for this situation, or here's the item that I can use that would, counteract this particular status effect. But the more time that...
Rest panic and gotta go fast.
Yes, exactly. So the thing is that you might be able to pick the most optimal choice, but if it ends up taking more focus and more time, you might just potentially choose the less optimal regular attack button, which is what your icon is hovering over by default. And while it might be not as optimized, it is quick damage and at least a decent option if you're running out of time and you want to try and get actions out as fast as possible. While previous turn-based strategy games would primarily test your, strategy, because you have all the time in the world to think, okay, if I think big picture, like, how am I going to plan this thing out so that I perform the exact optimal set of decisions? But by adding the time pressure, Final Fantasy IV makes it so that the game is also a test of tactics and reflexes. So you might come into battle with a pre-planned set of moves that you want to use, and you've got them all arranged in the menu to be easily accessible so that you don't have to take as much mental energy. You got all your items at the top of the list, you stocked up from the local shop. And then, inevitably, when the battles happen, things won't go perfectly according to plan. Maybe your healer's dead, so now you gotta resurrect them and quickly heal them up before the boss wipes them out. Or perhaps maybe the enemy ends up using Reflect on themselves, which makes it so that, oh shoot, that, Black Mage spell that you plan to use to wipe out the boss is now gonna get reflected at you if you just keep casting it without thinking.
Oh yeah, it's happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
Party wipe.
Yep. And similarly, aside from just dealing out damage, you've also got to manage healing up your party and dealing with the status effects as well. So basically, by giving you some additional unexpected things to juggle in the middle of the battle, you got to be able to not only tactically think on your feet as far as readjust your strategy depending on how the flow of battle is going, but you've also got to hone your reflexes so that you can mash through those, menus and get to your items as quickly as you can before, the worst happens. So yeah. It definitely helps the battles to be a lot more exciting, whereas previously they were more of a slow or more of a contemplative affair. Here you definitely are, racing against the clock as far as making all your actions count. Anything else you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think it actually made the series stand out a lot more. Its most common competitor in Japan was Dragon Quest in that series, and that series remains very turn-based. Whereas Final Fantasy has gone way more in an action RPG direction. And I think that's partly because of the success of the battle system introduced in this game.
Yep, that is a very valid point.
And I think that is important to keep in mind because the Oscarina, we were looking for games in their historical context, but also seeing what they have value as today. And has contributed to games today.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, while, some of the games, even nowadays, are still using the active turn system. I mean, granted, a lot of them are retro throwbacks, but they're retro throwbacks for a reason because, this battle system had a lot of appeal for people such that they want to keep having more of it. So, yeah, definitely a pretty influential innovation there as far as the gameplay is concerned.
I do want something to note. For accessibility reasons, this battle system, you could toggle how fast or how slow it was. You couldn't turn it off entirely, but for people like me who stress out too much, turning it a little slower was very helpful when I was playing through it.
Yep, and similarly for masochists like myself, you can also turn the speed all the way up so that you can just be, gripping your controller extra hard and trying to make those decisions as fast as humanly possible.
Feel the pain.
Yep. All right. So anything else you want to mention on that before I move on?
No, I think we can continue.
Sure. So another thing that I thought was pretty neat is that as far as difficulty and challenge and achievement is concerned, is that Final Fantasy IV is the first Final Fantasy game that introduced mid-dungeon save zones, which let you save and heal directly before a boss battle. So the downside of this is that it telegraphs the boss encounters, so yeah, okay, there's probably something bad behind that door. But because you're able to save right before you enter the boss room, it means that if you do get obliterated by the boss, you don't have just to wade through an endless array of grinding in order to get back to where you were at.
No boss run.
Yeah, oh gosh, that would be unfortunate.
Yeah.
And you might think, oh, well, this might make the game easier, but on the contrary, not necessarily, because having a save right before the boss actually allows the game developers to go a bit harder on the difficulty of these bosses. There's a lot of them where you're expected, based on the design, to not be able to beat them your first time, and instead you have to sit back, reflect on how it went, and try a different strategy. If they had boss save systems that were like way far back, they wouldn't have been able to do that fancy flying footwork. So that also allows them to experiment a bit more with the bosses. It also lets you sort of try out different strategies with the boss. If you're going to go all offense or all defense, or you want to try and exploit some elemental weaknesses, it's easier for you to go back and try something a bit different. And
sure.
Yep.
Yeah, mechanics like that that have a little bit more forgiving save systems really do encourage player experimentation in battle styles.
Yeah, and it's not like they make it a cakewalk by any means either, because, I mean, it takes a while to get through one of these boss fights, so if you get halfway through and you die, it's still enough of a slap on the wrist that you're like, oh, man, I should probably, think a bit more carefully next time. So, in my opinion, pretty good balance there, all things considered. And the last thing that it enables is Final Fantasy IV is definitely a game that expects you to grind a little bit as far as, you know, leveling up depending on your boss encounter. Having a place where you can save and heal up right before the boss will give players a option to do that grinding without, you know, having to backtrack really far or, you know, spend a lot of extra wasted time beyond the amount of grinding you have to do in the first place. So for all those reasons, I think that the mid-dungeon save zones are a pretty neat touch. Anything else you want to add there, Randy?
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly there, Corey. Having a save right before the boss gives you a chance to not get completely stuck in your save state, so to speak, and gives you a chance to grind stuff up if you need to, and so you're not in an unwinnable state, which was very common in games in this time period.
Blah. Yep. So I've heard. So speaking on the topic of grinding, so to elaborate a bit more on that, a lot of the regular enemies you'd be coming across in Final Fantasy IV, they were still tests of skill in the sense of like resource management, where you wanted to try and get through the enemies without spending too much of your HP or MP so that you'd be able to, you know, get through the dungeon. But individual battles, if you were fully stocked up and ready to go, were not really that challenging as far as being able to get through them most of the time. But bosses were usually the big progress keeper, and they were normally, you know, a difficult enough hurdle that you were obligated to grind in order to try and make it through them. But in my opinion, while I normally, you know, hate grinding with a passion, I think that Final Fantasy IV actually showed me how this could actually be done to some neat effect as far as the challenge and achievement system is concerned.
I for one, love grinding because I find it soothing, so I'm just an old fogey that way.
Oh, no, that's fine. Different strokes, different folks. I mean, keep in mind that the abnegation factor of, you know, games is literally one of the main tenets of it. Even if it's not one of our categories here, it's definitely something that's recognized as a valid way to enjoy your game.
I may campaign for a cozy category, but we'll see.
Hey, it might come up as a fun category, or maybe we'll add it as an official category, you know, in the later years once Harvest Moon and Animal Crossing have started to make that more of a mainstay.
Yeah, who can say?
Yep. But yeah, so the thing is that having these, you know, these gating boss battles, which were fairly difficult, did obligate you to grind a bit. But on the other hand, because of the active time battle system, how much skill you have could make the difference in how much you grind. So the YouTuber who I watched, you know, even though he was a veteran of the game, he was not able to just breeze through these things easy peasy, you know, because of his knowledge, at least most of the time, with a few exceptions that have gimmicks that you could exploit. So usually what would happen is he would try a boss a few times, and then if that wasn't working, he would go back, he would grind up a few levels, and he would try again. And if this system works out as well as it did for my YouTuber friend that I was watching, the boss battles would basically have something of a dynamic difficulty where players are rewarded for skill by not having to grind as much, and they can also choose how hard they want it, because if you want to have an easy experience where you can just steamroll through people, then you could just spend extra time grinding and make that, you know, not a problem. On the other hand, if you want to try and make it really hard on yourself, grind as little as possible, and then just try and see if you can, you know, tap your way through those boss battles and whatnot. So all things considered, I think that the way that grinding was handled in the original sounded reasonably good, I would say, you know, as far as how well it worked. Anything else you want to add there, Randy?
No, just that grinding was very common in games at this time. It was actually pretty much expected to pad out the length and get the most for your money. We don't see games that way nowadays, but I think a lot of people have a lot less time on their hands, and there's a lot more games out there.
Yep, both valid points, for sure. Alright, so the next factor I have as far as appreciating the challenge and achievement of Final Fantasy IV are what is termed by some fans to be puzzle bosses. So some people are less a fan of puzzle bosses, but for me, I am in love with them from a, you know, video game design point of view. So what these end up being is you have some boss battles where they're just hard and you just have to be expert at executing your strategy and adapting to the circumstances. Yeah.
So the get good boss.
Yeah, so you have some that are the get good boss, and then you have the get smart bosses, where...
Oh no!
Yeah. Where you will encounter these bosses, and if you just try your predetermined expected strategies, then you will lose like 90 to 100% of the time. These bosses will typically have some sort of a trick that will become apparent as a result of trying out different things on the boss. And, you know, if it's like a regular boss battle, then like, it might be something that you would naturally find through like, trial and error of like, well, let's do this. Oh, shoot, that didn't work. Let's try this. Oh, that didn't work. But for the optional boss battles, they could really turn those up a lot to the point where it's like, even if you manage to come up with the optimal strat, you'd have to be like, oh, shoot, I can't even execute my optimal strat at my current level or equipment. I'm going to have to go back and re-equip myself and get all suited up and ready to go to try this again. So yeah, these puzzle bosses are really neat because of the fact that, like, they definitely engage a different part of your think-outside-the-box critical thinking faculties, and they managed to do this all with the, same turn-based interface that, you would use for just mowing down mobs and stuff like that. So It's pretty impressive that they're able to manage to include these out-of-the-box solutions despite that. So,
and I actually think this series becomes really known for that at a certain point. I'm not sure if it starts here, but it might. But there's Final Fantasy has tons of secret bosses, and usually they have some kind of gimmick or just extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm. So just to run you through my 3 favorite examples of the puzzle bosses. So there's one that's not really a boss, but just more of a puzzle enemy, which is very entertaining. You end up coming across this single goblin in a late stage like dungeon, and you'd think, well, this doesn't seem particularly threatening. And what's more, he actually opens up early in the battle with something along the lines of like goblin used to identify on himself. And then it reads you out a list of stats, and it tells you weakness, lightning. And you're like, that's strange. Well, I mean, I guess if they're just trying to throw me an easy win, sure thing. So you use lightning on him, and then he goes, ha 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 ha. And then he triggers his super secret ultimate move. I forget exactly how it works. And it does massive damage to your entire party. So the game's just being a giant troll to you, and for falling for his little trick and whatnot. I mean, after that, you're definitely just gonna like, okay, get out of here, you stupid, and not really fall for it twice. But it's definitely, but it definitely makes you go through the dungeon with a little bit more, trepidation, knowing that they can pull some silly little trick on you like that.
I think I felt that way the first time I saw Tonberry.
Oh, Tonberry, man, that boss, that enemy creeps me the heck out from my childhood, man.
Yeah.
So aside from that, we also have the Asura alternate boss. This is an optional summon that you can unlock. The thing about Asura is that it has like 3 different attacks that are all chosen at random, but one of those 3 that it happens to pick is a self-healing move which heals for massive quantities of damage. So at first you might be like, oh shoot, maybe if I just get to a high enough level, or maybe if I just get good RNG, maybe I can beat it. But no, the actual way that you're intended to beat this boss is you're supposed to use the Reflect buff, which normally you direct on your own party to shield yourself from magic. You instead will direct it onto the enemy boss, so that when the enemy boss tries to heal itself, the spell will reflect off the boss and instead heal your party. So that
that's great.
Yeah, so that the boss doesn't have any ability to regenerate itself. And the thing is that this might be, if this was like a main, story like type of boss, this might gate progress for people and get them like, completely stuck so they couldn't progress. But because it's an optional boss that's tucked away in some random corner of the world, then whether the players get it or not, it's not a big deal. If they could just go back to the main quest. So,
I promise you I would have been stuck because it took me so long to even figure out that healing magic hurt undead.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, some of that stuff they don't really, like, intend for you to figure out. It's more of those things that they just save for the strategy guide or for the super veterans or things like that. But now that it's a staple, we all know. And so, yeah, I see where you're coming from.
Good that they didn't get progress behind something like that.
Mm-hmm. And then lastly, one of the puzzle bosses that I thought was particularly neat was the CPU boss. So, Final Fantasy is kind of an odd pastiche of different eras and technology levels. But there's one particular segment where you fight a giant robot, and the central processing unit of that robot is the boss of the area. So the robot, the CPU boss, has an attacker and a defender miniature guy who helps him out. And if you're operating off normal JRPG logic, you would try and murder all the weaker enemies first before you go after the main boss. That's just,
Oh yeah, for sure. You gotta get rid of the scrubs, otherwise, unless it's, tricky.
Yeah. So that's what you would normally do when you come into this. But then, if you happen to do that, then the CPU unleashes an extremely devastating attack where he insta-kills 2 of your party members and also deals a hefty amount of damage to the others, and he resurrects both of his minions in a span of like 1 or 2 turns or something like that. So, pretty horrible, all things considered. And if you leave both of the enemies alive, the little minions, it gets to be a pretty difficult boss fight, all things considered, through that method as well, because the defender is going to keep healing the main boss guy and to make it really hard for you to take him out.
Do you just kill one of the minions then?
Yeah, so the optimal solution for beating the CPU is you kill the defender, but you leave the attacker alive. And if you do that, then the boss will not trigger his super devastating ultimate move, and it becomes a more reasonable boss fight where you can actually just take out the main boss and just leave the attacker guy alive.
Interesting.
Yeah, so, I mean, I imagine that would probably be a pretty good stumper for certain people, but I still think that it's one of those things where it's conceivable you could have come up with the solution on your own, even if it would have been, you know, a bit of trial and error to figure it out and stuff. But it was designed to be a tough boss battle, so I mean, the fact that they're gonna throw a bit of a curveball your way is, I think, somewhat fair.
Yeah, I think it's cool. And I like that it's an instant, like, teaching you of don't do that. Figure something else out.
Yeah, more or less. Oh yeah, that's right. One final thing I had to mention is that the final boss of the game, Final Fantasy IV, is really hard. It makes it feel very climactic, and yeah, even if you've got all the best weapons, all the best summons, you're still gonna have to grind some in order to make it feasible, and, you know, if you don't have all the best weapons and summons, then you gotta grind a lot. So, it's definitely a truly epic showdown, but they have this unique boss battle music playing there. You got, like, an introductory cutscene where you got all your friends cheering you on, and, you know... Yeah, definitely helps the game if you're able to overcome this massive final, you know, hurdle to feel all the more epic and satisfying when you overcome it. But yeah, that's about it from what I had to say on the positives of Challenge and Achievement. Anything else that you wanted to mention before I mention a few of the cons there?
No, I think you addressed it all pretty well.
Okay, sounds good. So, on the con side of Challenge and Achievement, so the first one I forgot to write down in advance, but unfortunately, the Japanese difficulty from Final Fantasy IV, I would say that it was able to really make the most of the active time battle system, where you really had to push the limits of your own capabilities in order to make things work, and it made you pay more attention to the enemies and your own allies. But then the American release, the Japanese developers believed that we were not as tolerant of the very high difficulty games of the time, so they toned it down. But they probably went a bit overboard in how much they toned it down, because...
In fairness, I don't think they were wrong at the time.
Yeah, I don't think that they were wrong either, in the sense of how much we're less inclined to difficulty. But for me, I think that games like ActRaiser toned it down to a more, like, reasonable level of challenge for the American audience. But Final Fantasy II, on the other hand, toned it... Like, they literally had an easy version of the game that they sold separate in Japan.
Really?
Yeah, they had the regular version and the easy version in Japan, and they just localized the easy version. And that one, from what I've heard, has, like, very little challenge at all. Like, you don't have to grind, you can just, like, spam the attack button for most of the time. So, yeah, bit of a sight for sore eyes, but... For me, at least, I am reviewing the official Japanese level of difficulty, so that's what I'm going off of. But I just figured it's worth mentioning for any of the folks who, you know, were a bit confused with all this hard stuff I'm bringing up when they grew up on the American easy version, all things considered.
Yeah, no, clarifying that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Other con would be that final boss I mentioned, while he does have a very epic introductory cutscene where all your friends are cheering you on and you get to, you know, have the... you know, second phase of the boss activate. These long cutscene intros make death extremely punishing for the final boss. So if you're...
Are they unskippable? Was that
yes,
not
they
a
are unskippable. So...
Oh, no!
Yes, oh no, indeed. Which, yeah, it's, like, hard enough to begin with. So it's, like, because of that really long intro cutscene, if you're going into the final boss, like, you really gotta think that you're equipped and you can handle it and whatnot. Which, you know, you can't just keep... trial and erroring and hoping for good RNG. You gotta really, you know your strats, know your levels, and, you know, see if you can pull it off. So yeah, but all things considered, I think that's a little too much for me. I think that they should have made it skippable or a bit shorter if they wanted to go in that road.
Were skippable cutscenes even a thing back then? I'm not sure. So...
I'm not sure either. I can't really tell you one way or the other.
But it sounds like the need for them was there. Yeah,
and I think for us modern viewers, we're allowed to use our modern sensibilities to a certain extent and, you know, judge all these pet games for not having a modern quality of life, you know, as much as they, you know, as much as they didn't have access to it at the time, it still makes it harder to enjoy as a modern audience and whatnot.
True.
Yeah. Aside from that, as previously alluded to, regular enemies don't really pose that much of a threat, so they don't really end up pushing your challenge buttons that much. And
yeah, they're more annoying.
yeah, so I think they could have done a little better there, but I mean, it helps the bosses stand out a little more, so pros and cons. And then lastly, I would say that the puzzle bosses, I would say that once you find out the solution, at times they're not that hard. The gimmick sometimes really murders the boss pretty hard, which some people don't like, but I don't mind. It's like at that point, hey, I solved it. I did the thing. So I don't really feel like you need to give me another gamut of, a challenge. So I don't find that much of a problem, but other people do. And the other thing is that for certain bosses, like the CPU boss, there's no way to reasonably intuit the way to solve that the first time. It's got to be trial and error, so you're going to waste a certain amount of time trying out strategies and seeing that they don't work and trying another one. I personally don't think that's that bad, but again, other people might have a bit of a beef with that because of the fact that, there's no way you could have reasonably figured it out the first time, probably.
It's nice when there's some kind of signposting or some type of little side quest that will give you a hint or something.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
Alrighty, so I think I finished talking up challenge and achievement pretty well. So, moving on to our next category, we have Prelude for Best Musical Theme. So, the beginning of the song starts with a harp arpeggio, which, to me, has the feeling of being mysterious, hopeful, and mildly fantastical. After the beginning of the song, then, around the halfway point, a violin, a cello, and a flute all chime in with this sad melody, like the mournful, melancholic, beautiful kind of sad. And then with both melodies existing at the same time and one on top of the other, it allows the listener to be pulled in the mysterious, sad, and hopeful directions all at once for an experience that I consider musically transcendent in a way. The song, actually having these different parts, emphasizes the technical improvements of the SNES versus the NES. That initial arpeggio harp that comes in, that was the Final Fantasy Prelude that was known from the first 3 Final Fantasy games. And then, and it's more or less just staying more close to its roots. I mean, the harp sounds more realistic, but, it's not that much of a step up from your NES sound bit of, little chiptune type of thing. But then the second half comes in with 3 realistic sounding instruments, 4 layers in total, and it's a huge step up from the NES sound chip capabilities. So, to me,
it's beautiful,
Oh yeah, for sure. And for me, it sort of gets you into this sense of security, of returning to the familiar, right before it blows your mind with how much further that the SNES takes the sound capabilities. And it definitely helps you to get hype for the first Final Fantasy game on the SNES, and the new technical capabilities that come along with that. But yeah, anything else you wanted to chip in and add before I continue, Randy?
Just that it's such a soothing melody, too, and that it's associated with the crystals. Like, it has that strong association for me, and this association of safety and beauty that is something that I think a lot of people find in Final Fantasy.
Yeah, sure, I could definitely see it. But for me, I would say that the song works especially well as a title screen sequence and an end credit sequence. Because it sort of has that 3 different emotion trifecta I mentioned of being sad and mysterious and hopeful all at the same time, it sort of allows your mind to wander as you listen to it, to all the different events and moods and feelings that are associated with the game. You might be thinking about the characters involved and their journeys, and it overall just is a really impactful piece of music for being able to accomplish all those things for you at the beginning and end of the game. I would say that personally, I have a personal experience for this song. So prior to the Game Awards, I have dabbled a bit in the Final Fantasy franchise, but I haven't been like a diehard fan. But I remember that I was playing a character who would, in a tabletop role-playing game, who had suddenly gone through a bit of a, tragic loss in his own ability, and he started to doubt himself, and he was forced to be playing this harp as an instrument. So I just looked up sad video game harp music online to see if I could find any things that would particularly convey the theme. And Prelude was so much better than all the other sad harp music that I found that I literally just played that song on loop for like the 5 or 6 hour session that I had, and I didn't get bored of it. It just managed to convey the mood so well that I was able to roleplay my character on the next level, and it really stuck with me as being a magical song to channel that experience through. I definitely have a lot of positive associations with that song. Anything else you want to mention for me, Randy, before I move on to a couple of the cons?
No, it was just the saddest and the harpiest and perfectly fit that character. It was a good session.
Mm-hmm. All right, so then next up for just a couple of minor cons on the Prelude song. So, while others may disagree, I personally think that while the song works really well at the beginning and the end of the game, it's also used in the crystals room, and in my opinion, I think that the crystals don't carry quite the level of gravitas needed to carry the weight of the song. Now, mind you, that could just be a personal preference thing, I mean, the crystals are meant to be a central focal point for, the Final Fantasy plot and, a lot of the Final Fantasy games and whatnot.
Yeah, the series as a whole, I would say, often has to do with crystals.
Yeah, so I mean, I can definitely see, where they're coming from, but like, I guess for me, it's just, the song just carries feelings that are a lot more, intense for me, that like, I don't know if the crystals quite, manage to evoke the same level of feeling that the song does. But definitely, that's just more of a personal preference thing, and I can see why other people would come across a bit differently as far as their,
And I think actually, I would disagree slightly that I think the crystals do carry that, because they carry this mystery and this awe to them. They're essentially almost kind of God in these universes in some ways. And I think that does deserve that melody. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. And I would also mention that, Prelude is a great song, but it's used pretty sparingly throughout the game, in my opinion, so it doesn't have as large of an impact on the storytelling as, for example, the Red Wings or the Theme of Love songs, which play several places throughout the story of Final Fantasy IV, and they do definitely carry the weight of certain characters' arcs evolving and things like that. Nevertheless, I think that for its merits as a title and a credit song, and just being a generally beautiful piece of music, I think it deserves your consideration for Best Musical Theme.
All right. I actually think it might win.
We'll have to wait and see. Could be. Alrighty, so moving on here to Cecil for Best Male Character. So for all the remaining categories, I think that I'm going to have to include lots of spoilers. I mean, I already had some spoilers so far, but like extra mega spoilers from here on out. So, you've been warned, but
turn back if you don't want that.
Yep. But yeah, no way to really properly nerd out about it without getting into spoilers. So, that's what I'm going to do. So yeah, just to introduce Cecil, our main character, the game opens up with him being a dark knight, and in the introductory cutscene, he ends up ordering his division to murder a city full of innocent people in order to recover his crystal for the sake of his king. And over the course of the game, he ends up questioning his king, eventually outright rebelling against him and choosing to forge his own path. And then striving to actively oppose his king in order to, as well as Golbez, the person who's, puppeting the king behind the scenes, in order to try and prevent them from collecting the crystals and taking over the world. And in the process, also achieving his own journey of redemption as well, as he actually changes his class from a Dark Knight into a Paladin, which I will get into a bit more later, but I just wanted to give sort of a high-level summary of who Cecil is as a main character. As far as the Cecil introductory chapter, I think that was handled very well. All of the cutscenes involved with the character show him slowly starting to question his leaders and, question his own lack of courage in disobeying them, questioning how much he is a good person or not. And in general, it makes for some great introspective angst while he, broods over in his corner, very fitting of his Dark Knight moniker, which...
very focused on his angst, yeah.
Yeah, and I love me some angst in my main characters, so, definite bonus points there. So, as you explore the town, you get to see the different ways that the townspeople react to Cecil. Some people fear him, some people respect him, and depending on the townsperson, they might question the king or they might accept the king's rule. You'll come across a young kid who questions if Cecil is a bad man, which you can tell affects Cecil's conscience, and asks himself the same question.
For sure.
And you also come across an older woman who tells Cecil that, hey, whatever it is that no good that you're doing, keep Rosa out of it. She's basically saying that Rosa is too good for you, and you need to put a wall between you and her to prevent her from getting as affected as you. And Cecil definitely...
He does that, That's actually the first time we really see him interact with Rosa in a really significant way, is him pushing her away when she's very clearly really interested in him.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, getting to see, this interaction with the townsfolk sort of helps to better inform Cecil's inner monologue as far as, the sorts of things he might be considering when he's trying to, push Rosa away and so forth. And so, yeah, I think that it's really neat, the way that all these interactions with the town sort of give you a inner perspective on Cecil's psyche as he questions himself and the role he plays in assisting with the oppression from the king.
Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, so I think that the way that it sort of integrates the storytelling of Cecil with the way that you're exploring the first town and getting acquainted with the inns and the hidden items and things like that makes for a very good introductory chapter to the game, which I think I really appreciate. Anything else you want to chip in on that, Randy?
I was just gonna say I love all the little hidden items. I dig that in games a lot.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, Final Fantasy IV didn't quite manage to make a nomination for Best Exploration, but it definitely has some merits for all of those really fun little hidden items that they scatter around everywhere, as well as the NPCs that you end up exploring around for. Not quite enough.
Just remember the focus is part of why I didn't get one from me.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's fair. So yeah, as far as additional aspects that make Cecil a great character, I would say that his class and his associated class skills show his personality and his character arc. So before his class change, he was a Dark Knight, and his secret ability, Dark, will allow him to sacrifice some of his own health for the sake of inflicting large damage to all of his enemies. However, the damage gets lower as you get throughout the game, and it doesn't work at all against undead creatures. In my opinion, this is sort of the game trying to convey the idea that, using evil to fight evil is a lot more self-destructive, and ultimately it gets less effective on the truly evil ones out there and whatnot. So that makes for a nice little bit of gameplay storytelling integration.
Oh yeah, I think that's definitely the strong implication there.
Yeah, and then after Cecil ends up becoming a paladin, he gains a much larger health and defense pool, and he gains the defend ability instead of the dark ability. So it makes it so that if he uses the defend skill on another party member, he can take 100% of all the hits that would normally go to that other party member. And even when you're not using the defend skill actively, Cecil will still jump in and take the hit for any party member who's close to death a certain percentage of the time. So from a strategic point of view, you sometimes want to use the defend skill to guarantee the protection, but other times you might want to chance it and just, try and hammer away at the damage. But from a storytelling point of view, in my opinion, that shows that Cecil is no longer only concerned with undoing the wrongs that he had done via vengeance upon evil folks, but is now grown so that he is also trying to protect the weak and his loved ones and help them to achieve their goals, making him, truly worthy of being a hero to lead his band of miscellaneous characters, to save the world. I
gotta say what I love about it in particular is that at first it actually feels like a power downgrade, because Dark was pretty powerful. Even though it didn't work on everything, it was a really punishing attack, even if it hurt you in the process.
Yeah.
But Defend is so much better tactically once you learn how to use it. Once you learn that protecting your people you care about rather than just engaging in violence, once you learn that's more powerful, you become better at the game.
Oh yeah, for sure, and Paladin also is not susceptible to not being able to do anything against undead folks, but you know, when you were Paladin, when you transform, you're probably in the like 20-something level, 30-something, and then you switch to Paladin. Sorry.
Back to level 1.
Yeah, back to level 1, exactly. So your power level is downgraded at first, but eventually you end up eclipsing your Dark Knight in not just the defend aspects, but also your DPS and your health pool and just about everything. But it really does sort of reflect the character growth that Cecil's got to go through and whatnot, where, like, you know, this is a new role for him to fill. It's one that he's not used to, and he might be a little bit clumsy at first. It's not something that comes as naturally to him as his dark, brooding ways and whatnot, you know? So that definitely does show an interesting moment of character growth through that mechanic. I would also say that the switch to level 1 isn't the only time that the game uses that for storytelling effect. At the very beginning of the game, Cecil and Kane both start out at level 10, and all the enemies that you face out in the wilderness, you one-shot them. They are easy peasy, lemon squeezy, like not even a challenge.
Very fair. What I do want to say here is I think we also need to focus on the role of Paladin and how important that is for this game. This is one of the first time, I believe the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, in a video game that we see a Paladin as a playable character. This kind of, in some ways, invented, I don't know if it fully invented the Paladin, but it invented a lot of the Paladin as we know it that isn't just drawn from, like, D&D type stuff.
Well, that's the thing, though, is that D&D did come out before Final Fantasy, and it was the inspiration for a lot of these games and whatnot. So I know they were at least drawing from some degree of fiction and whatnot. But at least Mitch is under the impression that this was maybe one of the first times that you have the Dark Knight to Paladin transformation arc in a video game, which has definitely been something that's been used a lot of times elsewhere in fiction and whatnot. You know,
well, and I think even if it wasn't the first incarnation of it, it's one of the most famous and most well done, I would say.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, it also might be one of the more noteworthy instances of it in video games, even if it was present in other media a bit more commonly and whatnot.
Right. That's what I wanted to point out.
Yeah.
Before we move on.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say, in addition to his skills and his class changes, when Cecil makes the final moment of transformation in becoming a Paladin, Cecil also engages in a battle against a Dark Knight, version of himself. And you initially would start by fighting this as though it was any other, type of encounter. But if you do that, the Dark Knight version of Cecil is going to out DPS you, such that you will not be able to win the encounter.
By a lot. It feels like, at least.
Yep. And as you're fighting, there's this voice that ends up telling Cecil, it says, "A true paladin would sheathe his sword, and justice is not the only right in this world. Someday you will see." So basically, from a gameplay point of view, what this is hinting at is, in order to actually win this conflict, you need to stop attacking the Dark Knight version of Cecil, and you need to focus on healing and covering. Now, the thing is that normally, if you're just trying to win the battle from a strictly gameplay point of view, you would see, oh shoot, well, even if I heal myself, I'm not healing more than he's damaging me, this isn't going to work. So your inside brain of just from a strict gameplay, I need to win at whatever cost, is just going to make you want to attack. But from a thematic storyline perspective, if you take a moment back and you're thinking, you know what, maybe it's not about just trying to win this from a strict numbers game. Maybe I got to do what the story says is the right thing to do and put down my weapon. At that point, you do that for a few turns, and then the Dark Knight just vanishes, and you win the battle. And it's pretty epic. It's sort of open-ended as to what they're trying to say by claiming that Cecil needs to not directly attack this Dark Knight version of himself. But to me, it sort of indicates that, maybe Cecil's, Dark Knight version of himself does deserve some form of punishment as part of justice for the evil things he had done. But is Cecil getting what he deserves the most important thing right now? Or is it more important that the weak are able to be protected and the world be allowed to exist in peace with the aims of evil being thwarted? Because, because justice, he's specifically, the voice is telling you that justice is not the only right in this world, and he's also telling you to put away your sword. So it sort of implies that, like, justice might be enacted to some extent by, continuing to attack this Dark Knight, but you've got other things to worry about than that, and so maybe you shouldn't be as hell-bent on merely accomplishing this particular version of justice. And I don't know. But it is open-ended, and either way, whatever it means, it definitely draws a ton of attention to just laser focus on that thought that was coming into Cecil's mind. And it allows for good immersion, too, because that probably is what Cecil's thinking, too. It's like, well, okay, I won that, but, like, what does this mean? And, you know, the whole someday you will see, it means that that's definitely something that Cecil ponders and, you know, probably integrates into his character as the game goes on and whatnot. But, yeah, you want to say something, Randy?
Yeah, and I can say that I actually took it as him facing his own dark side. Not just facing his past, but facing and having to accept what he has done. And kind of to stop punishing himself, actually. And put that aside and actually change things. Change things in a way that is about defending people instead of punishing himself.
Yeah, I could definitely see that as a valid interpretation as well, for sure.
Yeah, accept your dark side.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty.
Yeah, either way, it's such an evocative scene, and that is one of the puzzle battles that the story is gated behind. So it needs the player to do that, to learn that.
Yep, oh man, and it's pretty, I will say it's pretty rough too, because if you actually don't figure, like, the game's sort of generous in the sense that, like, you have, like, probably 20 turns before you die to really, like, figure this out for yourself. But if you don't, you have a boss right before this boss, and you gotta beat the other boss, too, before you can challenge the dark side of Cecil again. So, pretty rough, but hopefully you get it on your first time, or at least your second, if not the first one and whatnot. So, yeah.
I may have taken 2 tries. I'm very unga-bunga in my game.
Yep. It's all good. Happens to a lot of players, I imagine.
Oh, yeah.
So then, as far as other admirable qualities for Cecil, I think that he is sympathetic. You know, I mean, his hesitance to question the king when he had previously done when the king had previously done great things for Cecil is understandable to a certain extent, and the situation overall is pretty complicated. The story explains why later on, but, you know, this is a king who, like, you know, raised, effectively, you know, Cecil from young, and historically, at least, had been a good king. So it's like, you know, turning your back on him is not an easy thing.
Right.
I would also say that Cecil is fairly understanding, you know, when he ends up confronting some of the people that he had wronged. There's one particular quote where he says, "I won't ask you to forgive me. It's my fault you lost your mother, but at least let me protect you, please." I think that definitely, you know, shows a wider understanding of how his actions have affected people negatively, and, you know, he considers the consequences of that with the full gravitas that they deserve and stuff like that. You know, he's not just pushing it away as, oh, whatever, I'm better now, it's no big deal or anything like that, you know. But
he's taking responsibility for what he did and trying to fix it, even if he doesn't really know how.
Yeah, definitely. As previously alluded to, I like the fact that he's brooding and reflective over his past actions. And in general, I think that Cecil, you know, he encompasses a redemption story where the stuff he does is legitimately sucky, even if it is sympathetic and relatable. And in my opinion, it avoids the common, you know, pitfall of redemption stories where they make the sucky stuff not really that sucky, you know, as far as people really doing something that needs redeeming in the first place. And I mean, his journey of redemption, you know, I mean, they do have a definite turning point in the form of the Paladin, but it's not always like a, you know, straightforward and easy road to doing that and whatnot. It's something that, you know, it plays out gradually over the course of several hours, and, you know, by seeing that, you know, it's definitely a well-executed arc, all things considered.
For sure.
Anything else you want
to point out? That he's also very pretty.
Yes.
Final Fantasy is famous for its pretty boys, but Cecil's actually kind of a rarity in that he's both very beautiful, but also very masculine and, like, stereotypical Prince Charming, knight in shining armor kind of thing. And I honestly, I was not expecting that when he took off when he's transitioned from his dark knight edgy helm to his beautiful flowing golden locks.
Yep, that is definitely a perk to the character, I can agree.
Yeah.
So, moving on to our next category for Final Fantasy IV, we have Best Direction. So, we already were covering some aspects of Best Direction when we were regarding Cecil's character development, hence why I talked about Cecil before we talked about Best Direction, both with, you know, Cecil's class change and Cecil having his backstory communicated by the town. But in addition to Cecil, all the other characters have their own classes and unique skills that also convey important information about their character. So,
oh yeah.
Yeah, which is also great gameplay narrative harmony right there. So outside of Cecil, the best example of this would be Tella. So he's a sage character that encounters you who appears to be fairly experienced, well-traveled, and old. And because of this...
he's also very powerful. Like, you get the impression that he is a strong wizard.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, definitely. It's like, having this fireside chat with you, and he's talking about, oh, Righty is actually pretty powerful and she'll come into her own if, given the time and the proper, practice and stuff. And it makes it clear that he's got a good grasp of magic and, can tell both how to hone the abilities and when to pick up on when it's strong in other people. So definitely seems like he's been around as far as magical abilities go. But this isn't just conveyed through the narrative. This is also conveyed through his character class and his stats. So as he joins you, when most of the rest of you guys are just barely starting to get like fire, thunder, and ice, he has access to all the end game magic, but with subpar stats because he is old. So he ends up having only 90 magic power. So you could try spamming all the end game spells, but it's going to use up your magic really fast. So you'll,
Oh, so fast.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's worth it to just nuke something that's annoying you.
Oh, absolutely. And it means that you can just have the option to nuke stuff that you're counting on the regular battlefield if you don't mind the MPUs. And it also means that if you're strategic about it, you can save it up for the boss battles and then really, mop the floor with them if you're, careful about how you do the moves. They also, to try and balance this to not make it too overpowered, the initial way that they do it is they give him access to, I believe, the level 1 and level 2 spells that you can choose on command if you want to conserve MP and also exploit enemy weaknesses. But if you want to use the level 3 spells or the other endgame spells, you have to use the Recall special skill. So basically, Tell has forgotten how to use all of his end game magic, but if you use
old.
Yep, but if you
remember.
Yep, but then you use the recall option and he will cast an end game spell, but it's going to be randomly chosen. So you don't have that much control over it. So it ends up, adding a little bit of risk reward factor there so that, even getting to use those end game level spells isn't just a surefire way to win.
And it's fun as heck because it's that little gamble.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. Plus, because of the fact that, you're this little, puny little player who's used to playing with fire and ice, having recall and literally having no idea what comes out, and then it's like, whoa, what was that? It definitely, blows your mind and gets you more excited for when you yourself are able to cast those spells later on in the game and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so he's at first only able to cast his late game spells with the recall ability, but then after the point in the story where Cecil becomes a paladin, he also manages to remember all of his spells through, the same sort of magic that changes Cecil into a paladin. And what you'll notice is that he has access to all these spells, late game spells, but then he's got Meteo sitting in the corner. So Tella happens to have only 90 MP, but Meteo uses 99 MP. And you'll never get any more magic power as you level up. So it's just sitting there in your inventory, seemingly useless, making you wonder, what the heck is the deal with that? And in the story, all of the kids are telling the old man Tella, hey, you shouldn't try and use Meteo, you're too old for it, and, it's probably, not a good idea. So then, Tella was learning Meteo in the first place because he was trying to enact vengeance upon the big bad guy. So he does eventually use Meteo on the big bad guy, and it ends up killing him as a result. But the thing is that thing has a lot more impact when it happens because of the fact that they've been hyping it up this whole time. Everyone's like, oh man, I don't think you should do that. And the whole time you're just like, what is this? It's sitting in the corner and I want to use it, but I can't. And then they finally use it, and it ends up being somewhat effective, but also it ends up killing him, and it ends up sort of showing that, hey, maybe that same desire that you had, that you wanted to really, push the limits of power and what you could accomplish, that might have been
sacrifice, that darkness.
Yep. But yeah, that might have been the same sort of feeling that Tella had, where he was, willing to push and try and push for that power no matter what the cost was. And it, sort of shows the darker side of revenge where, if you pursue that power at all costs, then it's going to have some negative side effects on you and stuff. So nice little story. Oh, go ahead.
To clarify, we actually can't cast that spell till that time. He doesn't have the MP. There's no way to get it.
Yep.
It's just in there taunting you. Oh, I love that.
Yep, it's pretty great. And then, aside from the immediate artistic value of choosing skills and classes as storytelling tools, these skills and classes are also just very useful in battle, and they make it so that you value your party members a lot for having that skill. And by bonding to them in a gameplay sense, where it's like, oh man, I'm really glad that I've got Edward here to use his salve thing to heal up the whole party, it also gets you attached to them in a narrative sense, because it really makes them feel like a valuable contributing member of the party that you want to have around, And whereas if it was... Oh, go ahead.
The game does a really good job of forcing your party members in and out, so that you have to use everybody at different times.
Oh, yeah, that was
makes you actually care and use the people you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to use them. I like this person. Well, you gotta try to learn to like this one too, or at least find them useful.
Yeah.
Figure out a way to make them work.
Oh, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. And the fact that they're able to keep consistently, so yeah, every time that they've got a party member with you, you have to use them. You can't just put them on the, back burner and ignore them, which again, helps to make them feel like a, valuable member of the party. And if they were just sideline, you never touch them, then you probably wouldn't care as much. It also, yeah. And yeah, having all these characters come in and out of the party, it keeps the storytelling fresh along with the gameplay fresh, where basically you're frequently having some new interesting party member who's got a new skill or a new ability or things like that is a new change of pace for the battles. Both from
new character arcs sometimes.
Yeah, and you got new character arcs to deal with and new party dynamics as the party tries to interact with each other and things like that. So yeah, works for direction because of the fact that it helps the gameplay and the story. And in addition to that, they, because they also are just keeping the cast at any given time small, down to only up to 5 people, and they cycle people in and out, it means that, like, in any given scene, all the present members will usually have something interesting to say that's relevant to the character in the scene. So, if they just had the giant... I mean, I've seen this with other Final Fantasy titles as well as other video games, if you've got a party that's like 8 or more, then there's sometimes characters where they'll just go for long periods of time without talking and stuff, and it kind of makes their narrative impact of being there a little less. Whereas if you got this tight group of 5, then yeah, it's like everybody who's here matters and stuff, which is kind of neat.
That's especially egregious when it's an optional character a lot of times. When it's like somebody that you don't have to have at this point, so they have nothing to say ever.
Yep, indeed. So aside from the character skills and classes, I also alluded to the character stats conveying information about who they are. So I mean, with Cecil, you had the paladin having more health, the fact that he starts out at level 10 and mows down the initial enemies in one hit. But what's interesting is with Tella, along with having his maximum MP capped at 90, he actually levels down because of his old age. His stats will actually decrease.
Painful!
Yeah, painful indeed. His stats will actually decrease in some cases as he levels up because of the fact that he's older and whatnot. It really sells the idea of him being a powerful old sage who's a bit past his prime. Another aspect of cool direction that I think was neat is the fact that they actually have certain scenes play out as scripted battle sequences, which make the storytelling feel much more impactful. So, the battlefield is no longer just an area for you to clash swords, but it will also convey story. So I previously mentioned the aspect of Cecil where he's fighting his old previous self. That's like a real battle where you're actually interacting with it and stuff.
Yeah, not a cutscene.
Yep. But then there's 2 other very noteworthy examples I'd like to just highlight. So there's one character you meet later in the game named Edge, and again, mega spoilers here and whatnot, where he's supposed to be like the prince of his upcoming clan, and he's trying to search for his parents who went missing. So there's one particular segment where you end up fighting against these creatures that were sent out by this mad scientist guy, and you're fighting them as though they're any other enemy, and then midway through the battle, they start talking. And yep. And yeah, it turns out that midway through the battle, they're actually Edge's parents. And this mad scientist guy had turned them into these horrible monstrosities. And at first, when they're talking with you, they're still attacking against their will. And then they decide at one point to stop their attacks. And it's just a matter of dialogue where they're saying, talking to Edge and talking about how much they love their kid. And then they off themselves mid-battle because they don't think they can avoid harming him and stuff, which... Oof.
That's heart-wrenching.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes it all the more so because of the fact that this is told through a battle cutscene where you first think you're in the mode of adrenaline, like, oh shoot, this is a boss battle, I gotta really do my best. And then once you take a step back, it's like, oh my gosh, this is what they've turned Edge's parents into. It really, helps that hit a lot harder and whatnot, how much they've changed.
Crazy.
Yep. And then last example I want to bring up is, so Sage Tella... When you first encounter him, he was trying to look for his daughter, Anna. But tragically, when he finally does come across his daughter, Anna, she ended up dying. And Tella, at first, attributes her death to Prince Edward, because Anna had run off with Prince Edward, who she was in love with, and he's just really mad at Prince Edward. So this actually ends up playing out as a scripted battle sequence, where Tella, despite being a sage, ends up melee attacking Prince Edward. And at first, all of his attacks are missing, and Edward is starting to try and explain and be like, oh no, you don't understand, while like Tella is, you know, in his grief, you know, yelling out a bunch of insults and, you know, talking about how it's all Edward's fault and stuff. And as the battle goes on, Edward stops dodging the attacks and he gets gradually more quiet as he basically starts to accept Tella's, you know, comments to heart and blaming himself for Anna's death. And it ends up getting interrupted by Anna telling them both that to stop it and she doesn't want them to fight. But
is it like her ghost?
No, she was... So, sorry, to clarify, she was dying. They thought she was dead, but she was actually not quite fully dead. Okay. She was dying.
No, that's for clarification.
Yeah. So she was... So then she asked them to stop and whatnot. And so at that point, Tella strikes off on his quest for revenge. And even though she did technically stop the battle, I mean, I don't think that it was necessarily Edward that was such a clear-cut thing. Edward's still pretty broken up about her dying. And over the course of the game, it takes him some time to move forward despite her dying and stuff. But like, the fact that you get to see this, you know, descent into despair through a battle cutscene and, you know, Edward's actions playing out and whatnot, where he's not even dodging the attacks because he just starts to accept the blame for everything. I think that's really great, you know, battle story integration right there. So yeah, pretty neat stuff. Moving on to my last tidbit about direction. So as mentioned with Cecil, talking to the local townsfolk tend to help you inform you about the culture and customs of the local area. And if the town is home of one of the characters, then you also get to learn about the characters while talking to the townsfolk. I would say that the best example of this for getting to have the story told through your interactions with the town, other than the town of Barron where Cecil's from, is Mysidia. So this is actually the town where Cecil enacted his...
genocide?
his mass killing in order to obtain the crystal and whatnot. And the people of Mysidia are not happy about it. And Cecil... Yeah, I mean, Cecil does not resist any of their harsh comments or, as we'll see in the course of the town, their petty crime attempts at, you know, mild forms of revenge and whatnot. They might, you know, potentially not be killing Cecil because they, you know, don't think they can take him on. But as you talk to people, they will turn you into toads, they'll turn you into pigs, they'll poison you, they'll make you fall asleep and retreat outside the town. And it's great getting to see how it all play out. And the fact that they give you these status ailments, they're real battle status ailments. Like, the next time you go into battle, you will still be poisoned and stuff. So
also being a pig is hilarious.
Oh, yes, it is indeed hilarious. So, yeah, great little bit of gameplay narrative integration there, getting to see all the, you know... all the status and effects and, you know, mild revenge that gets enacted on Cecil when he finally encounters the residents that he hurt before. Alrighty, so that's about all I had for direction. Anything else you wanted to mention before I move on to Best Pixel?
Just that I would say this game is a really well-done, cohesive piece of art. And I think that's, you know, something that... part of why it stands out a lot.
Indeed, yeah. Alrighty, so next up we have Best Pixel 1991. So, among the other categories for Final Fantasy IV that were not nominated, it's pretty good in most respects, even if it's not quite good enough for nomination. The one that it is somewhat lacking in is the art direction department. In part, this is because Final Fantasy IV development started with the NES in mind. So, I mean... it didn't necessarily push quite the limits of the SNES that it could have. It could also just be...
It shows some of the limits, I think, there.
Yeah. And mind you, they did try and utilize the SNES hardware where they could. You have the Mode 7 scrolling as you're, you know, flying in your little airship. But on the whole, it's just not as impressive as some of our other entries. So overall, the aspect that helps Final Fantasy IV, in my opinion, stand out the most among the 1991 competitors is its influence among JRPGs. In addition to the active time battle system, Final Fantasy IV contained much more in-depth storytelling, better gameplay story integration, and both of these help to facilitate JRPGs transforming into more story-centric games. You'll see that Dragon Quest V, you know, took influence from Final Fantasy IV and made itself a lot more story-centric compared to its predecessor too, and that sort of kicked off the whole, you know, story-centric arms race as far as, you know, making JRPGs have these epic narratives and whatnot.
Yeah, and it's something the Final Fantasy series has really much continued for most of its games, is trying to keep story and its significance central to the games.
So overall, if you value games that manage to leave a large impact on the JRPG genre while still managing to be a fairly polished experience, then Final Fantasy IV may be worthy of your vote for Best Pixel 1991. Anything else you want to mention on the topic of Best Pixel, Randy?
I do think it's a really good contender. I don't know how well it's going to match up against some of our other games, but I think it has a chance.
Mm-hmm. Yep, fair enough. Alright, well, thank you, Randy, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight. Final Fantasy IV is up for 5 official game awards, including Best Pixel for 1991. If you want to experience it for yourself, there is the original Super Nintendo version, renamed Final Fantasy II, a PlayStation and Game Boy Advance version, a 3D remake for the 3DS, and a pixel-perfect remaster on PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch, which features many quality-of-life improvements. I personally most recommend playing the Naming Way Edition fan translation of the SNES version.
I was just going to ask about that, Corey. Which one would you recommend?
I personally most recommend playing the Naming Way Edition fan translation of the SNES version, which features a run button, the original Japanese difficulty, and from what I've heard, the most accurate translations. If you are a voter, we will hope you will consider Final Fantasy IV this Oscarina season. If Final Fantasy IV wins Best Pixel, it will demonstrate our respect for games that left a historic impact on the fans and developers of Japanese role-playing games.